Afternoon, Dr. May here. I hope you're having a good day. This is my 8th bi-monthly assignment. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So the first question is, why have the narrator and her husband, John, rented the colonial mansion, and what is its history, and what is the reaction of the protagonist to this estate? So the narrator and her husband, John, say they rent the colonial mansion for the summer, say so she can recover from, from what John calls a temporary nervous depression, in those words. And he believes that rest, fresh air, and isolation will cure her. And say the house itself, it has some sort of a strange history. Say it's been empty for a really long time, and was involved in legal trouble. Say my first say on page 241 of the middle paragraph, it said it was involved in legal trouble about the heirs and the co-heirs. And this kind of adds an eerie feeling. I just knowing that, that kind of put me in an eerie kind of feeling. And the narrator, the narrator is immediately suspicious, and say very imaginative about the house. Early on, she says that there is something queer about it, and why should it be let so cheaply? Let's see, that was a quotation. Yep. Say on page 240, the first paragraph, say that's where she says that quote. And she even jokingly calls it a haunted house. And that basically shows her creative mind, that she has a creative mind. And however, John dismisses her concerns, calling them superstition. Moving on to the second question. The second question, it says, what clue does the narrator's repeated lament, "What can we do?" give us about her personality? Well, say the narrator's repeated line, "What can we do?" reveals that, she feels powerless, and controlled. And for example, on page 240, the first paragraph, she says, if a physician of high standing and one's own husband assures nothing is the matter, what is one to do? And basically, this shows that she doesn't feel able to challenge John's authority. Say he's both her husband and her doctor. And that's to me, that feels a little weird. She feels trapped, basically. I mean, it's basically what it would be. Imagine if, someone who you're married to, who you love very much, is also your doctor. I mean, that could go two ways. You could either love it because you know your doctor on a personal level, but also maybe, her having a doctor like him, her husband, maybe he'll give her misleading information to say everything will be all right, when really it isn't. That's just something that I thought of. And so going back, she feels trapped, and basically the phrase, what can one do? That phrase, it suggests resignation. She has opinions, like believing work would help her, but she gives up, I guess, because no one listens. And this repetition just kind of shows that her personality is frustrated, passive, and just increasingly helpless. So moving on to the third question, how would you characterize the narrator's initial reaction to and description of the wallpaper? Well, at first, say the narrator strongly dislikes the wallpaper, and she describes it as, ugly, chaotic, and disturbing. And let's see, and on page 242, the first paragraph, she calls it one of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. So that's a real description there. So she also says that the color is repellent, almost revolting, almost revolting in a sense. And basically her description is showing her irritation, confusion, and the pattern is hard to follow, and it just seems almost alive in a sense. And so initially, her reaction is disgust and frustration, but also a strange fascination, which later, as we'll see, will grow into an obsession. Okay, moving on. Let's see. Okay, question 4. Okay, yeah, question 4. Who is Jenny and what is Dr. Mayher? I'm sorry about that. So my phone died. Anyways, question 4, it asks, who is Jenny? What is her relationship to the narrator? And what is her function in the story? Well, say Jenny is John's sister and the narrator's caretaker, and basically she takes care of the house and helps look after the narrator. And I guess the narrator describes her as a perfect and enthusiastic housekeeper, and that is from page 243, the middle paragraph right there. Yes. And Jenny's role is important because she represents the traditional domestic woman. I mean, she supports John's treatment and even believes that, writing is what made the narrator sick. And functionally, Jenny helps enforce the narrator's confinement. She watches her, limits her behavior, and unknowingly contributes to her decline. And say she also contrasts with the narrator, kind of. Say Jenny fits society's expectations, I guess, while the narrator kind of struggles against them in a sense. So, yeah, moving on to number 5. It says, by the 4th of July, what does the narrator admit about the wallpaper? What clues does Gilman give us about the education of the narrator and her increasingly agitated state? Well, say by the 4th of July, which, by the way, that's my favorite holiday, the narrator admits that the wallpaper is taking over her thoughts. She says, it dwells in my mind so. And let's see, and that is from page 245, the first part of the paragraph. Yep, 245, the first part of the paragraph. And I guess this shows her growing obsession. So we also see clues that she's educated. I mean, she analyzes the pattern using design terms, saying it lacks radiation or alternation or repetition, symmetry, some terms that, not every Joe Schmo would know. And basically this shows that, she is intelligent, but her thinking is becoming it's becoming obsessive and scattered. And, and at the same time, her mental state is getting worse. I mean, she becomes emotional, saying, I cry at nothing, and cry most of the time. And let's see, and I'll look for that. I'm sorry, my phone died and I just got thrown for a loop here. On page 245, 245, it says, I cry at nothing and cry most of the time. And this shows increasing instability and agitation. And again, with the mental health thing, I know that mental health is real. Crying at nothing and crying most of the time, for me, I really like to just kind of take a second and just analyze, what's going on. A lot of my English teachers have done that, and the different texts that I have read. but we can just see that her mental state is just declining, you know? I mean, like what she said, you know, again, you know, she's emotional, you know, crying at virtually nothing, you know, someone just breaking down in tears randomly. I'm sorry, that's not, I wouldn't call that normal, you know. And then crying most of the time, you know, that's something that's, you know, it's not okay, you know, it has to be addressed. And again, it's showing her instability, um, you know, and just her agitation, you know. Um, yeah. Uh, you know, again, you know, mental health, you know, it's something that I've, you know, is really close to me because I've had friends who, sorry to get so, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, but, vulnerable, I guess. But one of my friends, you know, they've had, not my friends, but like, I have known people who have gone through this, that it's not good. And I feel bad. But anyways, getting off track there, but just something that I felt like I had to say. Um, we could just see that she's not doing good. So number 6, moving on, number 6. It says, how does the narrator try to reach out to her husband? Is this her last contact with sanity? Do you think John really has no comprehension of the seriousness of her illness? I mean, say the narrator tries to talk to John about her condition and basically just and asks to leave the house. And on page 200, on page 247, she says, you know, she tried to have a real, earnest, reasonable talk with him, and then, however, you know, John dismisses her concerns and insists that, you know, she's improving, you know, basically just telling her, you know, that he's a doctor, you know, you're better. And this shows that he does not truly understand her mental suffering, you know. And this movement may be her last attempt at radiate rational communication. And basically after this, she stops trying to convince him and just becomes more absorbed in the wallpaper. And John likely believes that, you know, he is helping her, but he clearly does not understand how serious her illness is. And his control and her dismissal actually makes her conditions worse. Going back to what I said at the beginning of the video, that, you know, this is going to hurt her in the long run. You know, having a doctor that you are in love with, it can hurt you. Like, if my brother was my doctor, I mean, do you really think that he'd give a truthful diagnosis if I had, I mean, obviously, like if it was something serious, but if it's something that was non-life threatening, you know, I mean, what are the odds that he'd just be like, you're fine, you know, just go take this and you'll be fine, or do this instead of this, you know, you probably think I'm right, you know, because I know I am, because obviously we see this happening. You know, he doesn't see the red flags. He doesn't see that, you know, something is clearly going on, and he's just not doing anything about it. And, you know, it's her cry for help, and it's making her condition worse. But yeah, so moving on, number 7, it says, why do you think Gilman briefly changes the point of view from first person singular to the second person as the narrator describes the pattern of the wallpaper? And what effect does the narrator say light has on the wallpaper? Well, basically, you know, at times, you know, the narrator shifts into second person, which is you, when describing the wallpaper. And, you know, this draws the reader basically into her experience, and shows how intense and consuming her obsession has become. And she also explains that, you know, the light changes, you know, the wallpaper, basically the light changes the wallpaper dramatically. On page 249, the first paragraph, it says, there is one marked peculiarity. It changes as the light changes. And In daylight, the pattern is confusing, but it's still controlled. And at night, especially in the moonlight, it becomes bars, and it just, yeah. And, she sees a woman trapped behind it, and this shows how, I guess, her perception is becoming more distorted. And the effect of light reflects her mental state. The darker it gets, the more her imagination takes over. And moving on to the last question. It says, identify what has driven the narrator to the brink of madness, and how does she try to free herself from this element? What is the central irony of the story? Okay. So the narrator, is driven to madness basically by isolation. It seems like, if you're isolated for a certain amount of time, you're going to go insane. By the isolation, really the lack of control and being denied meaningful work. And John's rest cure actually forces her to stop writing and thinking, which actually worsens her condition. And the wallpaper becomes the symbol of her confinement, basically. She believes a woman is trapped behind it and tries to free her by tearing it down. And she says, I pulled and she shook. Here, I'm gonna try on page 200, on page 252, the first paragraph. She says, I pulled and she shook. We had peeled off yards off of that paper. And in the end, she fully identifies with the trapped woman, because she says, that I've got out at last, or something like that. Remember, I've got out last in spite of you, and basically, the central irony, is that the treatment meant to cure her actually caused her to break down, and John thinks he's helping, but his control and dismissal led directly to her madness. And even more ironic, when basically he finally sees her condition, he faints, showing he was completely unprepared for basically the result of his own actions, and there's, and yeah, that's the end. I just want to thank you, sir. Thank you very much for the class. I feel like I've definitely had a more understanding of fiction topics going through this class. Yeah, just thank you. Yeah. I hope you have a good summer. And thank you very much.